Now we're going to talk about gas transport uh, through the blood. We talked about how gas gets in the blood, um, and then we talked about how oxygen gets in at the lungs, carbon dioxide goes out, and then when that blood gets to the tissues, oxygen goes into the tissues, goes out of the blood, carbon dioxide comes in. Now we need to talk about the process in between, which is the transport of that oxygen and carbon dioxide. In order for pulmonary and tissue gas exchange to occur, oxygen and carbon dioxide must undergo a chemical reaction, right? That allows for these to be transported in the blood. Only 1.5% of inspired oxygen is dissolved in blood plasma due to its poor solubility. Majority is transported by hemoglobin. So remember erythrocytes. Remember those structures that we had talked so much about in chapter 19, I believe it was, erythrocytes. Remember their structure, the biconcave disc, remember the hemoglobin, etc., binding to oxygen, right? All right, so what do we have here? Hemoglobin, protein, found in erythrocytes. Erythrocytes, remember that, red blood cells. They have 4 subunits, which each include a heme group. Each heme contains 1 iron that can bind to 1 molecule of oxygen, right? 1 molecule of oxygen. Remember, oxygen floats around as O2. So when we're talking about molecule, we're talking about 2 oxygens bound together, double covalently bonded together. So each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules, so 4 O2s. So actually 8 oxygens, but 4 O2s, okay? Hemoglobin binds and releases oxygen by 2 reactions, right? We load and we unload, okay? So oxygen from the alveoli binds to the HB and pulmonary capillaries, the hemoglobin, and converts deoxy, doesn't have oxygen hemoglobin, to oxyhemoglobin, right? So HHB to HbO2. The hemoglobin with 1 to 3 molecules of oxygen is partially saturated. With 4, it's fully saturated. Once fully saturated, oxygen-rich blood travels to the left side of the heart and it pumps to the systemic circuit. Remember, that comes from the left ventricle. Unloading, the reverse, the hemoglobin in the systemic capillaries releases oxygen to the cells of the tissues, okay? So each hemoglobin, 4 oxygen molecules, releases those oxygen to the cells of the tissues. Oxygen poor blood returns to the left side of the heart, to the right side of the heart, to be pumped back to the lungs, okay? So we have deoxyhemoglobin, binds to oxygen, ideally 4, becomes oxyhemoglobin, right? Goes to the tissues, unloads it, goes back to deoxyhemoglobin, heads back to the lungs. All right, this is just showing you a diagram of that, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, so as we have partial pressure of O2 in blood on this graph and percent of O2 saturation of hemoglobin, notice as the partial pressure of O2 increases, the amount of hemoglobins, the amount of oxygens bound to the hemoglobin, remember they can take up to 4, increases, right? So at point C, when a person exercises vigorously, your hemoglobin unloads most of its oxygen in the tissues. right? The hemoglobin entering the venous blood is only 25% saturated. Point B, when a person is resting, hemoglobin unloads only about 25%. So only about one oxygen is unloaded. Therefore, hemoglobin in systemic venous blood is about 75% saturated. And then hemoglobin is almost 100% saturated in systemic arterial blood, as no O2 has been unloaded to the tissue. So the blood coming straight from that's already gone to the lungs and now being pumped to the body, but it hasn't gotten to the tissues yet. Percent saturation, percentage of hemoglobin bound to oxygen, right? So we want to kind of understand this concept. Hemoglobin saturation depends on two factors: the partial pressure. Remember, we talked about partial pressure when we talked about Henry's and Dalton's laws. Partial pressure of oxygen in both lungs and tissues. And also tightness, affinity, or bond strength, which hemoglobin binds to oxygen. One of the main determinants of percent saturation is hemoglobin is the partial pressure of oxygen. So higher blood partial pressure, loading reaction is favored as more O2 molecules are available. If you have a lower partial pressure of oxygen, unloading is favored as less oxygen molecules are available to bind to hemoglobin. Hopefully that's not confusing. That's sort of in line with what we've been saying before, right? So the relationship between partial pressure and percent saturation of hemoglobin is represented by this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, which we showed you before, right? So percent O2 saturation. Your hemoglobin in arterial blood, we talked about at point A, has 97 to 100%. So at the point which your blood has gone to the lungs, now it's being pumped back to the left side of the heart, and it's eventually going to be pumped to the body. At that point, your blood is about 97 to 100% saturated, the hemoglobin. So most of the hemoglobins have 4 oxygens connected to them. After unloading oxygen in the tissues, your hemoglobin in the venous blood at point B has a percent saturation of about 75%. So you've unloaded about 25% of your blood, 25% of your oxygen. And then that point C, which we talked about, represents when during vigorous exercise, it can drop to as low as 25%. On the converse, your partial pressure in your blood, in arterial blood is close, your partial pressure of oxygen is close to 100 millimeters of mercury. So higher partial pressure of oxygen, higher O2 saturation. In venous blood, it's only at rest, it's only about 40 millimeters of mercury, lower partial pressure of oxygen, lower percent saturation of your hemoglobin. Right? And during vigorous exercise, it can drop even lower. And that curve, and they're talking about this curve right here. This is the curve they're talking about, oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, right? Just to make sure you understand that's what we're talking about. It has an S-shape, results from hemoglobin's changing in affinity for oxygen as your partial pressure of oxygen changes. So as your partial pressure of oxygen goes up, your percent saturation also goes up, right? All right, and so that's basically the idea. All right, so this is the curve again, and you see as your partial pressure of oxygen goes up, the amount of oxygen bound to your hemoglobin also goes up. You do have some things that can affect that. Effect of affinity of hemoglobin saturation. So increasing temperature decreases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. Facilitates unloading reaction of oxygen into tissues, and reverse is also true. Right? So increasing temperature decreases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen to make it a little bit more difficult to get oxygen into your hemoglobin, right? You also have the Bohr effect. When acidity and your partial pressure of carbon dioxide increase, right? As in tissues with higher metabolic rates, right? Tissues working a little bit harder. Your hemoglobin binds oxygen less strongly, so more oxygen is unloaded, right? You get more oxygen in your tissues. More oxygen is unloaded, right? Which is what your body needs when you are at a higher metabolic rate. And then you also have this BPG, by bisphosphoglycerate, which is made by erythrocytes as a side reaction of glycolysis. And basically, the levels of BPG also increase in response to epinephrine, norepinephrine, and they increase the demand for oxygen by increasing cellular metabolism. And this BPG binds with the hemoglobin, reducing its affinity for oxygen. Sorry, my daughter was trying to photobomb or video bomb us. But this is just a diagram just showing you some of the effects of on hemoglobin, temperature, hydrogen ion concentration, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hemoglobin loading and unloading. Carbon dioxide is also transported by your blood. Remember that carbon dioxide has to get from your tissues through your blood, and we have to breathe it out of your lungs. 7 to 10% of total carbon dioxide is transported, dissolved in your blood plasma, which is higher than your oxygen. 20% of your total CO2 is transported bound to hemoglobin. Binds to hemoglobin's peptide chains, not the same heme group that oxygen binds to. So it's called, so it binds to a different location than the oxygen. So it's called carbaminohemoglobin. So 7 to 10% in your plasma, 20% bounds to your hemoglobin, but the remaining 70% is transported in what we call bicarbonate ions. All right, so CO2 quickly diffuses into erythrocytes when it encounters carbonic anhydrase, right? So enzyme rapidly catalyzes a reversible reaction of water with CO2 to form carbonic acid. So the CO2 forms this carbonic acid in when it diffuses into the erythrocytes. And carbonic acid quickly dissociates the bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. And that's how CO2 is transported, right? So see that here, so this is your CO2 that your cells are creating as waste, H2O, water, everybody knows that, carbonic acid, which can dissociate into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen. All right, so we have this bicarbonate ion diffuses into the blood plasma, while the hydrogen ion binds to hemoglobin, acts as a buffer, resisting changes in pH. And we actually, I think we used to do this in lab where we would show you I think we do this in part, sometimes we still do this in part 1 of this class, where we show you the effects of this buffer system. But this bicarbonate ion carries this negative charge, counteracted by a chloride shift. Chloride ions move into erythrocytes, bicarbonate ions move out to balance charges. So you can have this sort of balance of charges as that happens as well. But this is all basically just this is the way that CO2 is transported. And the reverse reaction happens at the lungs. Carbonic acid is reformed in erythrocyte from bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, converted into water and CO2. And CO2 can diffuse into your into your alveoli. So that's just a way that what I want you to remember, not necessarily the whole equation, even though this is a good equation to remember because this is actually used in the body to help balance our pH in our body. Remember, our pH 7.34 is very our body has to maintain that pH, and this helps balance our pH. But it also just know that that's the way that carbon dioxide is transported. Okay, and this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, as I said, 7.35 to 7.45 is the range. And if pH rises, hydrogen ions are released, which is just showing you this equation. If your pH rises, we remember more hydrogen ions lower the pH. So if our pH rises, we can release more hydrogen ions. If our pH lowers, we can go the opposite direction with CO2. When pH decreases, it becomes more acidic. H binds with buffers like bicarbonate, making carbonic acid. pH increases, becomes more basic. Same reaction generates hydrogen that decreases pH. Okay, so it's a buffer system. It can go in either direction based on what's necessary for your body to maintain its pH. Remember, body has to maintain its pH so that we can continue to do certain reactions in our body. All right. But just know that that's a way that carbon dioxide is transported. Carbon dioxide forms this, transported through this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. And that's how it's transported through one of the ways it's transported through our bloodstream and therefore reaches our lungs, converts back to carbon dioxide, and we breathe out. All right, there are some effects of ventilation on your partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your blood. So hyperventilation is the rate and or depth of breathing increase. So you breathe, hyperventilate is you breathe more than normal, increases the amount of carbon dioxide expired from your lungs. Less carbonic acid is formed. So that means less hydrogen ions are formed and your blood pH can actually rise, right? Hypoventilation, you breathe less than normal, causes more carbon dioxide to be in your blood, increases your partial pressure of your carbon dioxide. More carbonic acid is formed and therefore more hydrogen ions, and therefore your blood pressure, not your blood pressure, your pH of your blood drops, right? So hyperventilation and hypoventilation can affect the pH of your blood. It also affects the amount of carbon dioxide being retained in your body. We also have carbon monoxide. Right? You probably have all heard of this. They tell you to get smoke detectors that also can detect carbon monoxide. That's important for a number of reasons. But the main reason that I want you to remember is that carbon monoxide binds reversibly with hemoglobin, producing carboxyhemoglobin. It occupies oxygen binding sites. Remember, carbon dioxide does not occupy the same site that oxygen occupies. Remember, carbon dioxide binds a different site on your hemoglobin. Carbon monoxide occupies the same location on the heme that oxygen occupies. So what does that mean? What does that mean? It means if carbon monoxide is bound to your hemoglobin, oxygen can't bind to it. And carbon monoxide is 200 to 230 times more, has an affinity 200 to 230 times more than oxygen. So basically, it suffocates you because it doesn't allow your blood to be able to bind oxygen. So you breathe in, but the oxygen can't get to your blood. Therefore, you basically suffocate because that oxygen can't get to your body. So small concentrations of carbon monoxide can be very problematic, cause confusion, dizziness, nausea, and even death. And what can we do to help treat that? Increase the partial pressures of regular oxygen by putting you in a hyperbaric chamber, for instance. All right, that's why carbon monoxide is so dangerous. Found in smoke, cigarettes. Don't smoke, people. Hopefully I think I mentioned that before, but let me drive that point home again. Don't smoke. And this is just putting it all together, just understanding respiration. We change our volumes, we use the different muscles, oxygen goes into our blood, carbon dioxide comes out, it transports through our blood, oxygen bonds to our hemoglobin and gets to our cells and then goes into our cells. And you can look at this diagram more and study it and understand the whole process. There's a nice video in the lecture. If you want to watch the video on your own, you can do that. All right, and then the last section we have is just the neural control of ventilation. Right, so breathing usually occurs without conscious thought. And what does that mean? It means that you don't have to, very simply, you don't have to think about it. When you are sound asleep, when you are not thinking at all, your mind is, you're dreaming about anatomy and physiology. You're dreaming about your boo or whatever you may be dreaming about. You still breathe, even if you don't think about it. You still breathe. One of the reasons, we can't hold our breath till we die is we pass out, and then our body takes over and starts breathing again. You'll pass out before, if you tried to hold your breath and you say, I'm gonna kill myself, I'm just gonna hold my breath till I die. What happens is you'll pass out. Remember, we talked about with carbon monoxide poisoning, it can cause you to dizziness and pass out. Hold your breath. You hold your breath long enough, you could pass out. But what will happen when you pass out is you'll forget to. You won't consciously be stopping your breathing, and your body will unconsciously start breathing again. It's something that we don't have to think about for it to happen, just like we don't have to think for our heart to beat. These things happen unconsciously, without conscious thought or control. There is something controlling it, but we're not consciously controlling it. All right, so we do have some terms here. Dyspnea, where feeling of shortness of breath may result from many causes. But what we generally want is normal breathing. We want to normally breathe. We want normal tidal volume to be happening. All right, so how is that controlled? The basic pattern is from our brainstem, the medulla oblongata, which we talked about when we talked about the brain and the functions of the brain. So some of this will probably be just a review for most of you all. This should be a review. All right, so the brainstem is the region of the brain that controls ventilation, neurons in the pons. Remember, if you forget what section of the brain that is, you can go back over it. I think it's like chapter 12, 13, 14, right around there. Neurons in the pons influence respiratory rhythm. You have respiratory rhythm generator, which is a group of neurons that creates basic rhythm for breathing, found within the ventral respiratory column. Then you also have neurons found in the medullary reticular formation. Remember that, the reticular formation, which also assists with your respiratory rhythm generator. move myself out of the way. Ventral respiratory group and anterior and lateral portions of the medulla oblongata. Contains both inspiratory and expiratory neurons. Then you also have the dorsal respiratory group and the posterior medulla, involved in inspiration, sending impulses along the same pathways to diaphragm intercostals as the VRG, right? And these all play a role in your breathing. All right, so let's talk about it, the control of rate and depth of ventilation. All right, so these, you see the medulla, see the pons, medulla oblongata, all part of this is in your brain stem. Dorsal respiratory group, phrenic nerve controlling your diaphragm, intercostal nerves controlling your intercostal muscles in between your ribs. Okay. All right, so in addition to the basic rate and pattern set by the RG, you have several other mechanisms, mostly a negative feedback loop. There is also some voluntary control. We can voluntarily control our breathing, which basically we can override or bypass the respiratory centers. So without conscious thought, I will normally breathe, but I can also voluntarily, I can hold my breath or force myself to breathe. I can do that, so my voluntary control can override my my medulla oblongata, which that will be my cerebral cortex, will be my voluntary control. Let's go, let me do this over here. You also have chemoreceptors that are involved, specialized cells that respond to changes. Remember we talked about if you have hypoventilation, you'll have elevated levels of carbon dioxide. Hyperventilation, you'll have lower levels of carbon dioxide. All right, so you have chemoreceptors, neurons in the medullary reticular formation. They can detect changes in the CO2 and the hydrogen. Remember, this is all related to your bicarbonate, which is, we talked about how your carbon dioxide travels through your bloodstream. These central chemoreceptors relay information to your DRG, which alerts your VRG, which can respond by changing the rate and depth of ventilation to match conditions detected. So if I have too much CO2 in my blood, I need to breathe out more. If I have too low CO2 in my blood, I need to breathe in more, right? Leads to loss or retention of CO2 and normalization of your blood pH. So we can detect changes based on your CO2 levels and your hydrogen levels. Or we can detect, changes in your pH and changes in your CO2 levels can cause us to breathe faster or breathe slower. All right. So if I'm exercising, I'm creating more CO2 in my blood because my cells are working harder, and when cells are at work, they produce CO2 as a waste, it's a waste gas. My CO2 levels in my blood rise. My nervous system is aware of that, my chemoreceptors pick up on that. My DRG and VRG recognize it and cause me to breathe faster. Very simply put. So high partial pressure of carbon dioxide or high hydrogen ion concentration triggers hyperventilation. VRG is stimulated, increases ventilation rate. When you increase your ventilation rate, when you breathe more, you lower your CO2 and you lower your hydrogen ions. When you have a low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, a low hydrogen ion concentration triggers hypoventilation, slows your breathing down, which will increase your carbon dioxide and your hydrogen ion, restoring homeostasis. All right, hopefully that makes sense. And this is just a diagram showing you that negative feedback pathway. All right, so basically we measure the CO2 and the hydrogen ion concentration in our blood. These chemoreceptors can measure that and increase or decrease our breathing to appropriately. Because remember, like we said, your blood pH has to stay at a certain range. And if it gets out of that range, or if the amount of CO2 in your blood gets out of a normal range, your body will respond by breathing faster or breathing slower. Showing you that. And then we have the influence of peripheral chemoreceptors, specialized group of cells in the carotid arteries and the aorta. We mentioned these a little bit, I think, when we talked about the blood vessels. They can detect a wide variety of stimulus, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen, but also they're sensitive, most sensitive to your partial pressure of oxygen in your arterial blood. So when your arterial partial pressure of oxygen falls below 70 millimeters of mercury, remember, right after that blood leaves your left ventricle, we should be around 100 millimeters of mercury of partial pressure of oxygen. Remember, it's very oxygenated at that point. Chemoreceptors can send signals to the DRG along the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves, triggers the VRG and increases ventilation. So I don't have enough oxygen in my blood, I increase ventilation, which makes sense. You also have stress receptors and voluntary control, which can change your rate and depth of ventilation. This is initiated by your pulmonary stretch receptors and walls of your trachea and bronchi. They are activated when one takes deeper breaths than normal, right? But as I highlighted in red here, you can only increase your depth of ventilation by so much. There is a limit to how much we can increase our depth of ventilation on our own. The ultimate effect is the stimulation of the DRG, which inhibits inspiratory muscles, protects lungs from overinflation, and helps maintain normal breathing. All right. So in general, you know, if you try to breathe in too much or breathe out too much, your body will try to stimulate your DRG so that you can get back to normal. Voluntary control, which is, like we said, you have the ability to sort of take over a bit. That's mediated by the cerebral cortex in your brain, which can bypass your respiratory centers, travels through your spinal cord to neurons of appropriate spinal nerves, and you can do some voluntary control. Right, and this is just showing you all of those in a nice little chart.